Roughly 40% of American adults have obesity. Across the Nordic countries, that figure is meaningfully lower, ranging from around 15% in Sweden up to the high 20s in Iceland. That's a real, well-documented gap, not a stereotype, and today we're going to look at the actual research behind why it exists. I want to be upfront about something before we go further, because it matters for how honest this video actually is. This isn't a claim that Scandinavians never struggle with weight, and by the end of this video, we're going to look directly at a report showing that gap has been narrowing in real, measurable ways over the past decade. What we're actually exploring is why a meaningful gap still exists, what's driving it, and what's changing. There's a reason this video is structured this way, worth naming directly rather than assuming it's obvious. A lot of content on this topic picks one comfortable half of the story and stops there, either an uncritical celebration of Nordic habits or a purely critical takedown of any claimed cultural advantage. Both versions are incomplete on their own. The actual research supports a real historical gap and a real, current narrowing of that gap simultaneously, and understanding both halves together gives a far more useful picture than either one presented in isolation. Real quick, if these videos bring you something, following the channel helps more than you'd think and takes about 2 seconds. Let's start with something covered in more depth in an earlier video on this channel: the built environment itself. Copenhagen's cycling infrastructure and similar investments across Nordic cities more broadly means a meaningful share of daily transportation happens through walking or cycling, built into the ordinary structure of a day rather than requiring a dedicated trip to a gym. Physical activity embedded into transportation, rather than treated as a separate, scheduled task competing for time against everything else in a day, tends to be far more sustainable over decades than exercise that has to be actively chosen and scheduled each time. There's a specific reason this distinction matters so much, worth spelling out clearly. Exercise that requires an active decision, changing clothes, driving to a facility, blocking out dedicated time, competes directly against every other demand on a person's schedule, work, family, fatigue, weather, and loses that competition often enough that consistency becomes genuinely difficult to maintain over years. Movement built into an unavoidable daily task, getting to work, getting to school, running an errand, doesn't face that same competition because the underlying trip has to happen regardless. The exercise isn't optional in the way a gym session is. It's simply the byproduct of getting somewhere a person was already going to go. Second, meal structure. Nordic eating culture tends to favor a small number of defined meals across a day, rather than continuous grazing or snacking spread across waking hours. This connects to something researchers studying eating patterns have found repeatedly: that continuous, unstructured eating throughout the day is associated with higher total calorie intake than the same amount of food consumed across clearly defined meals, in part because grazing makes it considerably harder to track how much has actually been eaten. Fika, the structured coffee break covered in an earlier video on this channel, is itself an example of this pattern: a defined pause with a defined role, rather than open-ended snacking with no clear beginning or end. There's a specific psychological mechanism behind why defined meals tend to outperform continuous grazing, worth naming directly. A meal with a clear start and end gives the body a distinct signal to actually register fullness against, a before and after comparison the brain can process. Continuous grazing, small amounts eaten repeatedly without a defined endpoint, removes that clear signal almost entirely, which makes it considerably easier to keep eating past genuine hunger without the same internal alarm going off that a defined meal's natural conclusion tends to trigger. The structure itself, not just the food inside it, appears to be doing real work here. There's a related detail worth adding, because it shows how deeply this specific habit is embedded into daily life across the region, beyond just fika specifically. Workplace lunch culture across a lot of Nordic offices tends to follow the same defined block logic: a set window, often eaten away from a desk, treated as a genuine pause in the working day, rather than something squeezed in between tasks while still working. That structure removes the same continuous eating pattern from the workday that fika removes from the mid-morning and mid-afternoon, extending the defined meal principle across essentially the entire waking day, rather than applying it only to breakfast and dinner while leaving the middle of the day unstructured. Third, food policy specifically aimed at children. Sweden banned television advertising directed at children under 12 back in 1991, a policy covered in more detail in an earlier video on this channel. Reducing early, repeated commercial exposure to sugary and heavily processed food, specifically marketed to children, has a measurable effect on the eating habits those children carry into adulthood, according to research on childhood food marketing more broadly. The mechanism behind why this specific policy matters is worth spelling out. Food preferences formed in early childhood tend to persist, in modified form, well into adulthood, and marketing aimed specifically at children is designed to build brand recognition and preference at exactly the age when those preferences are most malleable and most likely to stick. Removing that specific channel of influence doesn't eliminate a child's exposure to less healthy food entirely, but it does remove one of the most effective, well-funded mechanisms for building a lifelong preference toward it, before the child has developed any real capacity to evaluate that marketing critically. It's worth being honest that this specific policy has real limits too, which connects directly back to the socioeconomic research covered later in this video. A 1991 ban on children's television advertising was written for the media landscape that existed in 1991. It doesn't cover targeted social media advertising, influencer marketing, or product placement in the kind of online video content children actually consume most of today, decades after the original law was written. A policy this specific, however well designed for its original moment, inevitably ages as the surrounding media environment changes around it, and the gap between what the law covers and how children actually encounter food marketing today has almost certainly widened considerably since 1991. Fourth, and this connects to research covered in an earlier video on Nordic diet science specifically, whole grains, fatty fish, and rapeseed oil, the actual components studied in the CIS diet trial, are associated with more stable blood sugar and better overall metabolic markers than a diet built more heavily around refined grains and higher amounts of red meat. A dietary pattern that keeps blood sugar more stable across a day tends to produce less of the hunger-driven overeating that a diet built around sharper blood sugar spikes and crashes tends to produce. There's a specific physiological chain worth naming here, because it explains why blood sugar stability connects so directly to actual weight outcomes rather than being a purely abstract metabolic detail. A sharp blood sugar spike, typically produced by refined carbohydrates eaten without much fiber or protein alongside them, tends to be followed by an equally sharp crash roughly an hour or two later, and that crash is frequently experienced as sudden, urgent hunger, even when actual caloric need hasn't changed much at all. A diet built around slower digesting whole grains and fiber-rich foods produces a flatter blood sugar curve, without the same dramatic crash, which means less of that specific, physiologically driven urge to eat again shortly after a meal that should have provided plenty of energy already. Now, I should say this clearly, because understanding the research behind a pattern is different from actually applying it to your own life. That's exactly why I built the Scandinavian Reset, and the kitchen and meal planning module inside it walks through building exactly this kind of structured, sustainable eating pattern. It's a real guide, not another video, worksheets included. Links in the pinned comment, or you can find it directly at www.scandinaviansecrets.shop. Fifth, portion culture, tied to lagom, the concept covered in an earlier video on this channel about owning less and feeling richer. The same just enough principle that applies to possessions shows up at the dinner table too. Portions sized to actual hunger rather than maximized value. A cultural default that runs directly against the supersizing pattern common in a lot of American food service specifically. This connects to a broader psychological pattern worth naming directly. In a food culture where larger portions are marketed as better value, a plate size becomes an external cue competing against the body's own internal hunger signal, and research on portion size consistently shows that external cues, a larger plate, a bigger default serving, tend to override internal fullness signals more often than most people realize. A culture where the default portion is calibrated closer to actual typical hunger, rather than maximized for perceived value, removes a lot of that external pressure entirely. simply by never presenting the oversized option as the default choice in the first place. Those 5 factors, walkable and bikeable infrastructure, structured meal timing, early food marketing restrictions, whole grain and fish-forward diet composition, and portion culture, combine to produce a real, measurable, and well-documented gap between Nordic and American obesity rates. None of that is myth or stereotype. It's the actual research. Now, the part I promised at the start of this video, because presenting only the flattering half of this picture would be dishonest, and this channel has always tried to give you the full, real research, rather than the comfortable version of it. In December 2025, the Nordic Council of Ministers released a report called Normo, tracking health behavior across the Nordic region from 2014 to 2024. The findings were genuinely blunt. 56% of Nordic adults are now classified as overweight or obese, and 1 in 5 children. The Secretary-General of the Nordic Council of Ministers described the region as heading toward becoming, in her words, a sedentary and overweight population, spending excessive time on screens while eating less healthily than a decade earlier. She specifically called the findings on food worrying and said the report made for grim reading. It's worth naming what makes this report specifically credible, rather than treating it as just one more piece of alarmist coverage. Normo isn't a media outlet's interpretation of scattered data. It's an official government commission status report, produced by the Nordic Council of Ministers themselves, the same intergovernmental body responsible for coordinating health policy across the entire region. When the institution responsible for improving these exact outcomes publicly describes its own region's trend as grim, that's not spin in either direction. It's an official body being unusually direct about a problem happening on its own watch. The specific numbers behind that are worth stating plainly. Adult obesity in Sweden rose from around 10% to 15% between 2014 and 2024. In Finland, from 14% to 24%, nearly doubling in a single decade. In Iceland, from 21% to 28%. The increase wasn't limited to adults either. Childhood overweight and obesity rose too, with researchers specifically noting that the parallel rise in both adult and child rates points to shared environmental causes, not just individual choices made by adults alone. That last point deserves particular attention because it undercuts a common assumption about how weight-related trends typically get explained. If only adult obesity had risen, it would be easier to attribute the shift to individual adult decisions, changing jobs, changing life circumstances, decisions made independently by millions of separate people. The fact that childhood rates rose in parallel, at the same time, across the same countries, points towards something operating at the level of shared environment and infrastructure instead. The food actually available and marketed, the amount of unstructured screen time built into an ordinary week, the physical activity opportunities actually accessible to an average family. Children don't typically make independent purchasing or lifestyle decisions the way adults do. Their rising rates reflect the environment adults built around them, more directly than adult statistics alone ever could. The report identified specific, concrete causes behind this shift, not vague cultural drift. Nordic populations are eating less fruit, less vegetables, and less whole grain than a decade ago, while eating more red meat and more sugar, moving in the opposite direction from the dietary pattern that produced the CIS diet research findings covered earlier in this video. Sales of energy drinks specifically have doubled over the past decade, a category researchers have flagged for its association with sleep disruption and metabolic effects, particularly among younger consumers. And screen-based sedentary time has increased substantially, cutting directly against the walkable, active daily structure covered earlier as one of the actual protective factors behind the historical Nordic advantage. It's worth connecting each of these specific findings directly back to the 5 protective factors covered earlier in this video, because the erosion isn't happening in some separate, unrelated category. It's happening in exactly the same categories that originally produced the advantage. Less whole grain and more sugar directly reverses the CIS diet dietary pattern. More screen time directly displaces the walkable, active daily structure. Rising energy drink consumption, frequently sipped continuously throughout a day rather than consumed as part of a defined meal, works directly against the structured meal timing covered earlier. This isn't a new, separate problem emerging alongside the old advantages. It's the specific mechanisms behind the historical gap running in reverse. There's a socioeconomic pattern worth naming too, because it complicates any simple story about national culture protecting an entire population equally. Research specifically conducted in Stockholm found that neighborhoods with lower socioeconomic status were saturated with advertising for ultra-processed food, considerably more than higher-income neighborhoods in the same city. Obesity itself tracks closely with education and income level within Nordic countries too, not just between Nordic countries and the rest of the world. A quarter of children from lower education households were classified as overweight or obese, compared to 16% from higher education households, with obesity specifically at 7% versus 2%. Whatever protective cultural pattern exists here isn't distributed evenly. It's considerably stronger for some households than others. This connects to something worth stating plainly, because it changes how the entire first half of this video should actually be understood. The 5 protective factors covered earlier, walkable infrastructure, structured meals, food marketing limits, whole grain diets, portion culture, were never universal, equally accessible cultural traits shared identically by every household in every Nordic country. They're patterns that hold more strongly in some neighborhoods, some income brackets, and some countries than others. And the Stockholm advertising research shows precisely why. Even inside a country with a strong food marketing ban aimed at children, a specific neighborhood can still end up saturated with ultra-processed food advertising, simply through channels the original 1991 policy never anticipated or covered. The protective factors are real. They were just never as evenly applied as the flattering, simplified version of this story usually suggests. So here's the honest, complete picture, holding both halves of this at once. The historical gap between Nordic and American obesity rates is real, and the research behind it, walkable infrastructure, structured meals, early food marketing limits, whole grain and fish-forward diets, and portion culture, is genuinely well documented. But that gap isn't a fixed, permanent cultural immunity. It's a set of specific, concrete habits and policies, and the same Normo report shows clearly what happens when those habits erode. More screen time, more processed food, more sugar, less produce. The gap has narrowed measurably over the past decade specifically because some of the protective factors covered earlier in this video have weakened in practice. Not because the underlying research about what helps was ever wrong. There's a specific comparison worth making to close this out, because it captures the actual shape of the situation better than either the flattering or the alarming version alone. Denmark and Sweden currently sit toward the lower end of the Nordic range, while Finland and Iceland sit considerably higher, and that spread within a single, culturally connected region is itself informative. If Nordic identity alone were doing the protective work, you'd expect roughly similar outcomes across all 5 countries. Instead, the outcomes vary considerably, tracking much more closely with which specific habits, walkability, meal structure, diet composition, have actually persisted in each country, rather than with any shared regional identity that supposedly applies equally everywhere. The actual lesson here isn't really about any single country. It's that none of these protective habits are permanent cultural traits, immune to change regardless of what a population actually does day to day. They're specific, concrete choices, embedded into infrastructure, food policy, and daily routine, and they hold up only as long as those specific choices keep being made. Denmark and Sweden currently sit at the lower end of the Nordic obesity range specifically because they've retained more of these protective patterns than Finland or Iceland have over the past decade. That's not a fixed national character. It's a measurable difference in which specific, changeable habits have actually persisted. There's a practical version of this worth carrying forward, regardless of which country you actually live in. None of the 5 protective factors covered in this video require living in Scandinavia specifically to apply. A walkable commute, a defined meal structure instead of continuous grazing, a diet weighted toward whole grains and fish over red meat and sugar, and portions sized to actual hunger rather than maximized value, are all individually adoptable choices, not exclusive cultural traits locked to a specific region. The Normo report is really a warning about exactly the opposite mistake, treating a protective pattern as permanent and automatic, rather than something that has to be actively maintained, in Scandinavia just as much as anywhere else. If this gave you a fuller, more honest picture of this topic, following the channel means a lot. And drop your next video idea in the comments. I read every single one, and a lot of what ends up here starts right there. Och som alltid. Vi ses nästa gång.